Yes, my people, David Udeyi don't release the real truth and the real sponsors, the real origin of Boko Haram video. This one not be whether I don't know whether a movie I go call about. Watch this video critically from beginning to the end. You go see the work where this young man don't do on top of this investigation when he do. Bring out all the proof and the videos and everything where they involved in the whole sponsorship and everything they have for Boko Haram and everything. Watch this video from beginning to the end. Now waiting no agree our DSS do for how many years? Now David Udeyi don't do like this. Since they no agree publish their name, make the whole world see. Oh yeah, watch this video. Somebody when they independent, when they ready to solve the problem of this country, don't they do the work of DSS where they not agree to. Watch the video. Make DSS they busy they pursue social media influencers. Watch the video, man, Michelle.
In May 2021, a 96-year-old businessman died in Rome, Italy. Ahmed Idris Nasreddin had amassed a personal fortune of close to $500 million in his lifetime, but his death barely made the news. Nasreddin was an Eritrean who moved to Jos in Nigeria's Plateau State and grew his father's small manufacturing business into a $460 million conglomerate involved in everything from breakfast cereal and confectionery to pharmaceuticals, real estate and energy. After many years of growth and success, he eventually handed his sprawling business empire over to his son, Atia Nasreddin, and retired at an old, satisfied age. In an official statement released after Nasreddin's death in May, Plateau State Governor Simon Lalong said, NASCO has over the years remained a major employer of labor in Plateau and continues to contribute to the economic prosperity of the state and Nigeria at large through tax revenue and corporate social responsibility. Well, that was the cover story anyway. In reality, as is so often the case in Nigeria, the gap between the facts and the information released to the public was so wide as to be scarcely believable. What on earth could this shrewd, respectable businessman who looked like he could not hurt a fly have done to put him in a story about the world's deadliest terror organization? Why would the brand he built, which to many Nigerians evokes memories of a beloved childhood breakfast cereal, appear in the same sentence as Boko Haram? To answer these questions, our story begins on another continent in 1955, some 8 years before his father would move to Nigeria and establish NASCO. The year is 1955, and a 33-year-old Islamic scholar from Gumi in modern-day Zamfara State, northwestern Nigeria, has made his way to Mecca for his first Hajj pilgrimage. Alongside him is a certain Ahmadu Bello, who is the premier of northern Nigeria. During this trip, the scholar impresses both Ahmadu Bello and Saudi King Saud with his Arabic translation skills. He rapidly makes a big impression on many locals and clerics in Mecca. These relationships will later become his most valuable asset following subsequent events. Upon returning to Nigeria, he takes up positions teaching Arabic studies at Islamic schools in Kano and Kaduna. Now, his style of teaching focuses on educating his students about the differences between Islamic religious doctrine and local customs. Based on his strict Sunni understanding of the Quran, he teaches his students to adopt a pure Islamic identity at the expense of practices that he considers bid'ah, which can be roughly translated as innovation or corruption. He also becomes the first Islamic scholar to translate the Quran from Arabic into Hausa, which puts him in a uniquely influential position comparable to that of Ajayi Crowther, the 19th century Bible scribe in southwestern Nigeria. Using this leverage, he becomes an increasingly powerful figure in northern Nigeria, with his essentialist views on Islamic doctrine gaining popularity. To him, the existing Sufi orders of northern Nigeria are polluted with bid'ah and unfit for purpose. He becomes well known for attacking the Tijaniya and Qadiriya brotherhoods during his appearances on Radio Kaduna, while advocating for a return to Islamic purity. Following the death of his friend and benefactor Ahmad Bello, the scholar finds himself in a precarious situation. The new Nigerian federal government, led by soldiers, has a motive to crack down on anyone who is outspoken and influential. He may be an intellectual giant in northern Nigeria, but without political and financial backing, he's a giant with feet of clay. His solution is to seek financial and political help from his friends in Mecca. The Saudis, as always, are eager to help. His Saudi backers are keen to use him to espouse the Saudi Arabian state's official interpretation of Islam, which is based on the work of 18th century Islamic scholar Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. This fundamentalist doctrine, often known as Wahhabism, fits very closely with the teachings of our hero in northern Nigeria, and he enthusiastically sets about gathering support for this new Saudi-funded project. In the 2009 book, The Wahhabi Mission and Saudi Arabia, historian David Cummins says, the Saudi-funded Muslim World League also sent missionaries to West Africa, where it funded schools, distributed religious literature, and gave scholarships to attend Saudi religious university. These efforts bore fruit in Nigeria's Muslim northern region with the creation of a movement, the Izala Society, dedicated to wiping out ritual innovations. Essential texts for members of the Izala Society are Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's Treatise of God's Unity and commentaries by his grandsons. Reaching out to his erstwhile students across Kano and Kaduna over the course of the 1970s, the scholar slowly builds a coalition of strategically aligned individuals that will someday become a very powerful organization in northern Nigeria. In 1978, one of his prominent students, Sheikh Ismaila Idris, takes charge of this increasingly powerful but still somewhat unofficial movement and calls it Jamatu Izalatil Vida wa Ikamatus Sunnah, which translates as Society of Removal of Innovation and Re-establishment of the Sunnah, which is also known as JIBUIS for short. Based in Jos and known colloquially as the Izala movement, this organization will go on to become the most influential Islamic body in Nigeria over the next few decades. Its members will become some of Nigeria's most revered imams and clerics. They will achieve high ranks in the Nigerian Armed Forces. They will even sit on the Federal Executive Council as ministers of state. Jibus will come to exert a level of influence over Nigeria's national politics and governance that is unprecedented for a religious body in Nigeria. Soon, it will become almost impossible to achieve power in many parts of northern Nigeria without identifying with the Izala movement. Among other things, the scholar states that Muslims should never accept a non-Muslim as ruler, which can be interpreted as a call for insurrection against the Christian Nigerian president. He's never held to account for this statement, and in any case, he no longer believes that writing books or teaching people about Islam will, on their own, lead to an Islamic renaissance in northern Nigeria, which is what he wants. Now, he's all about partnership and political action. He maintains his membership in northern Nigeria's legacy Islamic group, which is called Jamaatul Nasrul Islam, but he is unmistakably the beating heart of the new Izala movement. To all intents and purposes, this is the birth of modern Salafi Islam in Nigeria. Without firing a single shot or contesting in an election, this Islamic scholar has become one of the most powerful men in northern Nigeria. His name? Abubakar Mahmoud Gumi. Fast forward 33 years. It's Christmas Day in 2011. A bomb suddenly goes off at St. Teresa Catholic Church in Madala.
Frankly speaking, I thought the war has ended.
Killing 35 people and wounding a further 52. Almost simultaneously, a series of coordinated bomb attacks and shootings takes place at churches in Jos, Tadaka, and Damaturu. An obscure Islamist group calling itself Boko Haram claims responsibility for the attacks. During the trial of the main suspect, Kabir Umar, also known as Kabir Sokoto, 2 years later, a masked witness claims that an Algerian Islamist group provided funding and support worth 40 million naira, which was roughly $250,000 at the time, to carry out the attacks. To the general public, it is unclear what the link is between Islamists in northern Nigeria and well-funded terror groups in North Africa. To those in the know, however, the incidents of December 25, 2011 are not only expected, but are likely to intensify and become more regular. This is because while the Nigerian public up to this point has been fed with what amounts to a tiny percentage of the actual story behind Boko Haram, this group has in fact been incubated at the highest levels of the theological, economic, and social establishment in northern Nigeria. Boko Haram in reality is so much bigger than its two most famous faces, Mohammed Yusuf and Abubakar Shekau, that reducing it to these two men serves to miss the actual story spectacularly. To start to get a sense of what Boko Haram is and where exactly it came from, let's go from 2011 back to 2006 and read this excerpt from a letter written by Permanent Representative of Nigeria to the United Nations, Aminu B. Wali. Now, this letter was addressed to the chairman of the UN Counterterrorism Committee. It lays out in some detail the measures taken by the Nigerian government to fight terrorism in Nigeria. I'll take special notes of the names mentioned in bold. A WikiLeaks cable from 2002 confirms that this arrest of the cleric named Yakubu Musa Kafanchan actually did take place, only for the suspect to be released inexplicably after 27 days in detention. For those who are not aware, Yakubu Musa Kafanchan, also known as Sheikh Yakubu Musa Katsina or Yakubu Musa Hassan, is a founding member of the Izala movement or Jibwis. He is in fact the current chairman of its National Board of Trustees and the chairman of the Katsina State Jibwis chapter. He is a widely respected Islamic cleric and a very close personal friend and public associate of, no prizes for guessing, Isa Pantami. Yes, that Isa Pantami. Mr. Kafanchan was even recently named as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center, a Jordanian government-affiliated NGO, and we'll come back to that later. So apparently, as far back as 2002, Mr. Kafanchan was known to the Nigerian security establishment as the leader of a terror network trying to set up terror cells in Katsina and Kano. And you should keep that in mind because this information will become even more important as this documentary progresses. Now, according to this official Nigerian government communication to the UN Counterterrorism Committee, this real-life terror cell organizer was known to have affiliations with a certain group called GSPC, which previously tried to carry out terror attacks in Nigeria, and he was even arrested for it in 2002, which was 7 whole years before anyone in the world outside of northern Nigeria ever heard of something called Boko Haram. Yet in 2021, he's not only a free man, but he's a powerful free man with access to federal ministers, state governors, and even Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari himself. That brings us to the GSPC, which was referenced in the UN letter. So what is the GSPC? GSPC stands for Groupe Salafiste pour la Prédication et le Combat, which means Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat. Basically, it's a legal Salafi terror organization based in Algeria, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It specializes in providing training, funding, and support to Islamists and jihadi fighters around the world, using a global network of smugglers, money launderers, and rat line. This brings us to the second name in the above letter. Alhaji Shahru Haruna, in the Nigerian government's own words, was a GSPC agent who funded the activities of people like Kabir Sokoto by laundering proceeds from smuggled goods. He too was arrested and held on terror financing charges. And somehow he too is not only a free man today, but also a powerful one in his own right. You probably won't be surprised to find out that Alhaji Shahru Haruna is also a ranking member of the Izala movement. Now, according to these posts which I dug up from Facebook accounts linked to the Kano State Izala movement chapter, Shahru Haruna is the deputy president of the Kano State chapter of Jibwis. Like Yakubu Kafanchan, this indicted terror funder not only retains his position in Nigeria's most influential Muslim body, but is also a respected Islamic preacher with access to the who's who of Nigerian politics and governance. Even more interestingly, when I did some digging into Mr. Haruna, I discovered something potentially even more alarming. Now, it will be recalled that in September 2021, CBN Governor Godwin Emefiele claimed that a significant portion of dollars bought by Bureau de Change operators in Nigeria goes into the illegal importation of arms. Speaking at the end of the monthly Monetary Policy Committee meeting, he said, "Whether it is Boko Haram, kidnapping, and all sorts of nefarious activities, BDCs take our country's dollars and sell to people to go and buy arms and ammunition to come and hurt us. That's what people want us to continue to do. We cannot do that any longer. We can't. If you have any legal, legitimate business you want to conduct, please take your business to a bank. They will sell you for it." A search of Nigeria's Corporate Affairs Commission database for the name Shahru Haruna turned up a plethora of companies registered under the Dandima name, including a bureau de change. Now, for reference, this man, Shahru Haruna, who was identified by the Nigerian government itself as a security threat for funding terror via money laundering, was somehow allowed to own and operate a bureau de change, which, according to the CBN governor, could well have been funding terror via money laundering. A CBN circular from October 2020 confirms that, at least as recently as 2020, Shahru Haruna was allowed to run a bureau de change in Nigeria, potentially giving him access to the very funding and laundering infrastructure that he should not have been given access to under any circumstance. Now, a glance at the other Dandima business entities on the CAC database shows that even the email address used to register them belongs to this bureau de change, which says everything about how central it is to Shahru Haruna and his business interests. And in case you're wondering if this picture can get any worse, the answer is yes, it can, and it will. Take note of the name circled in red. Zahraddin Shahru Haruna is Shahru Haruna's son, so it is no surprise for him to show up as a director on his father's bureau de change registration document. There's just one problem. Remember the CBN governor saying that BDCs facilitate terror financing? Well, just a month before he made those comments, the CBN sent out a circular with the names of 18 companies and an individual whose bank accounts were to be frozen with a PND, which means post no debit, mandate. Very unusually, no reason was given for the instruction, and also unusually, there was an account belonging to an individual on the list, which was otherwise made up of just corporate accounts. And what was this individual's name? Yes, that guy. Now let's rejoin our Eritrean friend in the year 2006. The Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, NFIU, had recently been gazetted, and one of the very first things its counterterrorism unit did at the time was to freeze all assets linked to NASCO Group Nigeria Limited. Apparently, Mr. Nasruddin had been doing some creative accounting to hide the fact that he was moving money around the world to fund Islamist terror organizations. Or at least that was what the Nigerian government itself wrote to the UN in the same letter. A WikiLeaks cable from 2002 hinted at American hesitancy on the subject of freezing NASCO's Nigerian assets due to the economic implications for Plateau State and political implications in Nigeria. The real proof of Nasruddin's double life, however, came from the US Treasury Department, which published a comprehensive account of how he laundered and moved money around the world for terror organizations. Want to hear the real kicker? Nasruddin had been funding and laundering money for none other than GSPC, the Algerian terrorist group which Yakubu Katsina and Shahru Haruna were also involved with around the exact same time. The Nigerian jihadis being trained in Algerian camps in 2002 would later return to Nigeria and make up the core of what would later come to be known as Boko Haram. And, what a coincidence, it just so happened that NASCO was also based in Jos, which so happens to be the headquarters of the Izala movement, from where it conducted its many North African dalliance. So using money made from these market-leading FMCGs marketed by NASCO to Nigerian consumers, a cross-border network of terrorism was being nurtured. These terrorists would someday return to Nigeria and kill the very kids eating NASCO cornflakes every morning. And it was all thanks to this nice gentleman from Eritrea. The thing about Ahmed Idris Nasruddin, however, is that he was a rich man. And like all rich men, he had a way around problems that would have grounded other people. Now, in 2005, Lisa Myers and Aram Ruston of the NBC News Investigative Unit discovered that despite his designation as a terror financer in the US, Nasruddin's Nigerian business empire and his Italian hotel were still operating as normal. Quoted in the story, Victor Comras, a former terror finance expert at the US State Department, said, "This isn't a loophole. This is failure to implement the sanctions appropriately. He's been involved in terrorist financing. Let's put him out of business." That would prove easier said than done, because just 2 years later, in 2007, the LA Times published a story indicating that, to all intents and purposes, Nasruddin had cut some kind of a deal with the US government. This deal likely involved asset forfeitures, but it was never made public. Essentially, his name was taken off the list of terror financiers after being indicted for funding terror. Now, this terror that he had funded had found its way into the lives of the very Nigerian consumers that made him wealthy, but he ended up getting off the hook pretty much entirely. So for those who died in the Madola Christmas Day bombings facilitated by the people that he had earlier funded and supported, there would basically be no justice. Nasruddin got to hand over NASCO to his son and lived out the rest of his life in peace and relative comfort, dying at the ripe old age of 96. Now, I mentioned earlier that the dates of Yakubu Katsina's initial attempt to establish terror cells and Taliban training camps in Kano and Katsina was important. Here's why. Remember Abubakar Gumi's stated position that Muslims should never accept a non-Muslim as ruler? Well, it just so happens that the concerted push for Sharia law across 12 of Nigeria's northern states lines up perfectly with the election of Olusegun Obasanjo, a Christian, as president in 1999. Through the eras of Shehu Shagari, Muhammadu Buhari, Ibrahim Babangida, Sani Abacha, and Abdulsalam Abubakar, who were consecutive Muslim Nigerian heads of states, there was never a directed and concerted push for Islamic law across those 12 Muslim-dominated states. But following Obasanjo's entry, however, Zamfara, Kano, Sokoto, Katsina, Bauchi, Borno, Jigawa, Kebbi, Yobe, Kaduna, Niger, and Gombe states decided in quick succession to embrace a separate penal code from southern Nigeria, which was based on Sharia law. Why this piece of information is important is that it is key to understanding the political resonance of the Izala movement in northern Nigeria and the sheer amount of power wielded by indicted terror financiers and terrorists who still sit on its board. This in turn is central to understanding two things about terrorism in Nigeria. The first thing is that Boko Haram is a logical development growing out of the rise of political Islam in Nigeria, with its roots in Salafism, as popularized by Abubakar Gumi and his ideological heirs. The second thing is that it is impossible to divorce Abubakar Gumi's use of Saudi money and Wahhabi indoctrination in the 1970s from the adoption of Sharia law in northern Nigeria, the rise of violent Salafi hardliners like Abubakar Shekau, and the eventual mass uprising against the Nigerian state that will almost inevitably take place across northern Nigeria. It is also important to understand that while the Boko Haram brand might be an unattractive one, the goals of Boko Haram are by no means unattractive to those who make up the ideological core of the Izala movement, which has now become Nigeria's most influential Muslim body. Sheikh Aminu Daurawa, who famously praised the September 11 attacks in a 2001 sermon, with a quote claiming that Allah is a suicide bomber, would later become the inaugural chair of Kano's Hizbah police and also remains a high-ranking Izala movement member. With sympathizers and collaborators up to and including Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari himself, the Izala sect has no incentive or reason to fundamentally rethink or reform its ideology, which is directly and provably linked to Salafi terrorism in Nigeria. As long as Mr. 00 retains his obvious and unapologetic sympathy for an organization with clear and ongoing links to the enemy he claims to be fighting as Nigeria's president, the Izala movement has no incentive to reinvent itself. There's no way that the Nigerian president is not aware of Yakubu Musa Hassan Katsina's history as a known terrorist. And yet, as recently as 2018, President Buhari was pictured in Aso Rock meeting with Izala movement president Abdullahi Balalau, Yakubu Musa Hassan Katsina himself, Kabiru Gombe, and Ibrahim Jallo Jalingo. It is either I have more access to information about his friends and associates than the Nigerian president does, with all the alphabet soup intelligence agencies at his disposal, or he already knows all of this and he has picked a side. And it doesn't take a genius to work out which one it is. Certainly from the point of view of the Izala movement, this picture taken in 2018 was a statement that while a government led by a Christian may have arrested Yakubu Hassan and his terrorist peers in 2002, 16 years later, Hassan's ideological ally is now in office, standing proudly and solidly next to him, like he stood solidly next to Isa Pantami when his earlier pronouncements came to light. So basically, the Izala movement has won and Nigeria has lost. The only other angle of high-level involvement that has not yet been addressed so far is that of the Jordanian government. Now remember earlier where it was mentioned that Yakubu Katsina was named among the world's 500 most influential Muslims by a Jordanian state-backed NGO. Well, it turns out that the NGO in question, which is the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center, is itself affiliated with the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought. A little poking around revealed that this body published a paper titled Reports on the Interreligious Tensions and Crisis in Nigeria in May 2012. Produced by a state-funded NGO in Jordan as far back as 2012, these reports referenced alleged income disparity between Nigeria's Christian South and Muslim North, attempting to portray the latter as a victim of involuntary poverty and economic bullying at the hands of the former, without citing any data to support this conclusion. Now, very tellingly, at a time when conversations around violent clashes between nomadic Muslim cattle herders and traditionalist or Christian farmers were not yet present in Nigeria's news cycle, this Jordanian organization with links to Yakubu Hassan, a known Nigerian terrorist, was already recommending grazing grounds as a solution for a problem that did not actually exist yet. So 10 years later, the question is, how do they know?